Well, hey there, and welcome to Wedding Planning Simplified. It is a beautiful day in January here, and I hope that you are enjoying it. I'm Amy. I'm a wedding planner and educator here in London, Ontario. And if you are joining us for the first time today, welcome. If you're joining us because you're newly engaged, maybe you got engaged over the holidays, congratulations. We are so very happy for you. I actually have my newly engaged co-host, Jacqueline, who is just having some tech difficulties, but she is going to pop in momentarily so we can all congratulate her on her engagement, which is so exciting. We are here every Sunday at 1 o'clock to help you through issues that you might be having in your wedding planning. And because we know that actually 40% of engagements happen over the holidays, we thought that we would start off the new year with a little bite-sized series about searching for venues, because it can be kind of overwhelming, but it's usually the first thing that you do. And it's always the thing that impacts sort of the overall feel of your day the most. So finding a perfect venue is maybe secondary in importance to finding a perfect partner. Or, you might put the dress in there as well, depending on your own priorities. But it is really important that you are able to find a venue that really does a great job of sort of representing you as a couple and working with your wedding vision and your wedding theme, of course, as well as your wedding budget, which is, as we know, a four-letter word here in the wedding world. So we are going to talk you through today some of the things that you're going to want to think about when you are doing venue site visits. Now, last week, if you missed our live video, it is in the archives. You are welcome to go back and take a look at that. We talked about 3 different kinds of venues that you probably will be looking at. And it kind of, it's something that I like to think about when I'm putting things in neat little boxes. I like to do that and try and keep things with nice little borders and nice and clean and clear and put things into their compartments. And so when you're looking at venues, you'll be thinking about whether it's an all-inclusive venue, whether it's a semi-inclusive venue, or you might be thinking about doing a DIY venue. So if you hear me using those terms today and you have no idea what I'm talking about, check out our video from last week where we dive into what that really means. What's the difference between an all-inclusive venue and a DIY venue? So we're going to pop in today. Like I said, if you are newly engaged, congratulations. I was hoping Jacqueline would be here at this point, but like I said, she's having some tech issues, so she'll be back. But this is Jacqueline, who is my right-hand lady and my daily bacon saver and all of the things. And she got engaged over the holidays. So we are incredibly excited for her and for you if you're newly engaged. And you're hopefully still riding that high. And you're doing the right thing by checking this out and getting some resources to help you along the planning journey. So I'm Amy, like I said, I'm here to help. So if at any point you need anything, feel free to reach out to me. My email is coming up at the end of the slides that I'm showing. You can send us a private message here through Facebook. You can find us on the web. We're here to help. So if you're getting started, let us know any questions that you might have. If you are oh, there's Jacqueline saying Microsoft is updating. She'll be here soon. So let us know in the chat where you are in your plans. And if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to pop them into the chat. I will answer them as we go. And if you come up with questions after the fact, or if you're catching us on the replay, don't hesitate to send us a message or put a comment after this video. So when it comes to venue site visits, generally that's something that you're going to likely be doing before you book a venue. Unless you're booking at a place that you're really familiar with because you've been there a lot of times, you're going to want to do a site visit to see what you're dealing with, to talk to whatever kind of sales manager or site coordinator they have. There's Jacqueline. Hello.
Hello. I'm back. Sorry, everybody.
All good. We're having some tech issues today. My headphones aren't working, so please let us know in the chat if we're having an echo. I'm going to try and mute myself when Jacqueline's talking, and hopefully we can avoid that. But hopefully the tech is good. So Jacqueline, I'm going to back up my slides here for just a second because we just said congratulations.
Yay! Thanks, everybody.
So how are you feeling as a newly engaged lady?
Exactly how you described. Everybody feels like very excited at the start and both blessed with very blended families. After calling like 12 people, I was like, okay, that's it, right? We're done. That's it. We sign a paper now. That was the wedding. We did great. It's a lot. And I feel for couples. I don't think I ever have touched on that point of just how overwhelming that initial, like, oh gosh, I have a lot of attention on me, especially us pandemic girls that really enjoy sitting at home doing nothing.
I don't think you've ever done nothing for a second in your life, but
well, it feels like nothing.
Well, congratulations. And we're going to be looking very much forward to hearing all about your planning journey from the perspective of a wedding planner.
Thank you. And Jillian, I'm there with you. She just said that she didn't actually talk about their engagement until the next day. I actually got very sick the day I was proposed to. So I didn't really think about being a fiance until I felt a lot better about a week later. And now we can finally be like, hey, we're engaged. This is cool.
Yeah, I know that I didn't get the full story on the engagement, but I'm sure there was a comment in there about how you roll with the punches, and now you'll roll with the punches for the rest of your lives.
Exactly. It was something pretty well along those lines. It was like you were in the room. Well done.
Well, I did say I wanted to be a fly on the wall, but I wasn't actually.
I know.
So in any case, we'll pop back in here and we'll talk about the kinds of things that you will want to think about when you are going out and visiting venues, or we're also cognizant of the fact that a lot of you are doing private property weddings, tent weddings, barn weddings. So we'll try to touch on things that apply to those kinds of weddings as well, because you're going to do a very different kind of site visit. And we didn't want this to be an hour-long video. So we'll try to be concise, something that I'm working on. But we'll talk about some things in different categories that you'll want to think about as you're doing site visits. And that's the capacity and the aesthetics of the venue, that four-letter B word, budget, the flow, the layout, and the floor plans of the venue, the accessibility and staffing provided by the venue, and how that will help your transitions from part to part of your day. So to jump in to the capacity and the aesthetics of the venue, one of the things that we preach more than anything is you don't do anything with regard to wedding planning until you have a solid sense of your budget and a solid sense of your guest list. Because you have no idea what you're looking for in a venue until you know how many people you need to host and how comfortable you are spending how much money. So please make sure that you nail those things down first. And we've talked about those in the past. We'll talk about them in the future. We're not going to focus too much on the dynamics of guest list planning, but you need to have a sense, a realistic sense for both budget and guest list before you start looking at your venues. So when we get to the capacity and the aesthetics of your venue, first of all, you need to think about that guest count. You can count on about 10 to 15% attrition on your guest list, especially with COVID these days. If you have a guest list of 100 people, you can estimate that probably you'll end up with 85 to 90, although depending on where we are in this pandemic, it may be fewer than that because of people's comfort levels or restrictions. But don't book a venue that is too small and then find out that you never got your mother-in-law's guest list. And all of a sudden you're dealing with an extra 30 guests and you have nowhere to put them. Thinking about your vision of the wedding, talking to your partner a little bit before you start to look at venues is going to be really helpful as well. And you can often just do a Google search for a venue that you're interested in. And if it's an established wedding venue, you will find probably hundreds of galleries from photographers who've shot weddings there in the past. And looking through those galleries of strangers' weddings at this venue that you're considering could be a really great way for you to kind of focus in on the themes that they've done, the colors that they've used, and whether or not that resonates with you. If you're finding that every venue or every gallery for venues that you're looking at just doesn't, you don't feel it, you're not loving it, then maybe that's not the venue for you. You'll want to think about if there are any strong colors or designs in your venue. And I don't know, we could have the conversation about hotel carpet. I, for the life of me, can't figure out who chooses the carpet in hotels, whether they find their most colorblind design impaired employee and have them choose the color.
Yeah.
For some
They're
reason,
like, what color will mask spilt coffee, spilt wine, and muddy shoes? Perfect.
and then they come up with something that's orange and blue and geometric, and it's all wavy and it makes you dizzy when you look at it. Now, keeping in mind that once you fill up a venue with tables, with linens and chairs, and it's going to minimize any of those distractions, but there are some things that you can get over and work with, and there are some things that maybe you can't. So thinking about whether your venue has any really strong design or physical components to it that you can't change, and whether or not you're okay with that. And conversely, is your venue so beautiful that it won't need much decor? So does it just fit the vision? And that's the dream.
Yes.
Our second topic is the budget, which of course is so important. And I'm doing a budget meeting after we finish up here. That's the first thing I always do when I book new clients, is to do a budget to get a really good sense of where they're comfortable overall, because realistically, my assumption is that you're not looking to remortgage anything or sell any organs to finance this wedding. So it's kind of like shopping for a wedding dress. Don't try on anything that you can't afford, because you're going to fall in love and you're not going to be able to afford it. And then you're going to be really sad. And it's a really negative start to what should be a really exciting, positive time in your life.
And often I find, since the venue is typically the first thing couples go to find, it's usually the very first thing that blows their budget out of the water. It's really easy at the start of your wedding plans to think, well, we're going to be over $5,000, but we'll save here and there and blah, blah. In my experience, very rarely do I find us saving money as we get closer to the wedding date. It usually works the opposite. So if it's the first large purchase, you want to make sure it's within your budget. You don't want to start your wedding planning off already $5,000 down the drain that you weren't expecting.
Or 10 or 50,000.
Yeah, I was being very generous and light to try to keep the view counts high and not get the Sunday scaries out. But yes, it's more realistic that you could go $20,000 over your budget if you fall in love with a venue that is out of your budget.
So we generally say that your venue is probably going to take up about 50% of your budget. So if you start looking at a venue and you're doing some math and you're realizing that it's going to come in at 50,000, and you then do the multiplication to make that 50%, and you multiply by 2, and you're not comfortable spending 100,000, then back away from that venue. So generally 50% is kind of a good ballpark to think about when you're looking for a venue as part of your budget. So you'll want to, once you find a venue that you like the look of online, you're going to want to reach out to whoever does their sales, if they have a venue coordinator or a sales manager, and ask for their packages. Most venues will share those with you before setting up a venue visit. Some won't. Some will want to get you in the door, and they'll want to sell you on all of their beautiful elements and amenities. But if you can, try and get those package prices beforehand so that you can weed out the ones that you know you can't afford. And venues will charge differently. Some venues, if we're talking about, let's say, a semi-inclusive venue, like some of the barns around town, or some of the halls where they allow you to bring in certain elements, they will charge a flat rental fee. So you're just looking at a hall rental. If you're looking at an all-inclusive venue, they are most likely going to charge you a cost per guest, and it's likely going to include your food and your beverage. We talked about that in last week's video about how some of those packages work. But beware if there is a minimum. So if there's a minimum spend or a minimum number of guests, you're going to want to be really, really mindful of that, because sometimes if you don't hit that minimum, there will be an additional charge to make up their minimum room rental for a Friday or a Saturday night or whenever you're having your wedding. And the other concern is if there's a minimum guest count, that's something you'll want to be very aware of in the near future until we're out of this pandemic, which hopefully is soon,
Yeah.
just be really mindful that if you're signing a contract with a venue that is committing you to having 100 or 150 or 200 guests, what if capacity limits or restrictions from the government at the time of the wedding won't allow you to have that many guests? Will they still hold you to that minimum? So just be really aware of that. And we'll talk at the end a little bit about really reading contracts carefully. So beware of that. Some venues will charge an hourly rate. And it just really kind of depends. So regardless of the kind of venue that you're looking at, you're going to want to make sure that you have a sense of all of the costs so that you're not missing anything that is going to get tacked on at the end, like gratuities, for instance. So ask if they're charging a gratuity on top of the food and beverage. That can add an extra 15 to 20% onto your budget, which is not negligible. So make sure that you have a conversation about all of those fees before you sign on the dotted line. Another thing that is going to really dramatically affect your costs are your bar costs if you're at an all-inclusive or a semi-inclusive venue where they run the bar. So some venues will charge you a flat package fee, and it will give you X number of hours of open bar for X number of dollars per person. Typically, the venue is calculating this in their best interests. So they're trying to make money. Obviously, they're a business. So if there is the option to do the bar based on consumption, that means that they're only going to charge you for the number of drinks that have been consumed. I think my light just died. I've been plunged into
I was
darkness.
going to say, I was very worried that a lightning bolt somehow hit your
No,
office. I was like, what was that?
my ring light's dead. So if the venue will charge the bar on consumption, that means they're only charging you for the number of drinks that have been consumed. And often, depending on your guests, that's better for you because you're not going to be overpaying for drinks that aren't going to be consumed. If you have a really heavy drinking crowd, or if you're having your wedding at a hotel where guests typically drink more because if they're staying there, they can just stumble upstairs to bed, then you might not want to go with consumption. But those are some things to ask the venue coordinator if they'll do a cost estimate for you both ways, if they have both options. Or you may have the conversation about whether or not the bar is amenable to doing tickets or toonies or some other kind of moderated bar where you're going to be able to limit your costs a little bit depending on your priorities. If you're providing open bar for your guests, or if you're providing some kind of a limited bar or a cash bar, have that conversation before you sign anything. Now, some venues will have price differences based on off-season or off-day dates. So if you're not looking for a Saturday wedding in the high season from here in London, I'd say from May until end of October, then you may be able to save a little bit of money. And the other thing you're going to want to think about when you go to a venue is if they include things that you would otherwise have to pay for separately in their costs. So some venues provide the DJ in their package. Some provide the officiant. Some provide a fair amount of decor. Now, I also mentioned last week that sometimes venues include decor in their original quote, in their all-inclusive package, as one of those perks, but then their decor isn't actually something that you would want to use, and you end up having to hire something else anyway. So be mindful of that.
I think fairly frequently I hear, well, I just don't want to be that person. I don't want to ask too many questions. But when it's something as large as the venue, whether it's about the budget or just because it is such a big element of your day, it's okay to ask a bunch of questions. They're used to it. You're not the first. You won't be the last. Don't worry about it.
Absolutely. Now, if you are having a tent wedding, just to quickly go through some of the things that you'll want to think about. I know that I have had so many couples over the years say, oh, we have a big backyard. We're going to save so much money. Just be mindful that it's not just renting a tent. Of course, you're renting a tent, but you have to also account for any landscaping that you're going to do, whether it's to flatten an area to make space for the tent, whether it's just to pretty up the property. Sometimes there are additional costs for building permits. Here in London, if your tent is over a certain number of square feet, you actually have to have a municipal government permit for it. Sometimes that's covered in your tent rental. Sometimes that's an additional cost. You may have to pay your tent company to come out and do a site visit to make sure that they actually can put a tent up there. You may have to rent additional tents for musicians or for caterers, or you may want to cover the area outside your washroom trailer, for instance. So be mindful that it's not just the cost of the tent. You're also thinking about tables and chairs, linens for those tables. Don't forget about your auxiliary tables for things like guest book, gift table, card box. If you have a memorial table or a photo display or a favor table, cake table, you're going to need to make sure that you account for those in your numbers. Think about your dinnerware. Is your caterer providing your dinnerware, or do you have to rent china and glassware and flatware? Do you have to rent additional glass for the bar? Some caterers will provide the dinnerware, the actual flatware and the china, but they don't provide glassware. So do you have to provide table glass? Do you have to provide additional tableware, plates and utensils for cocktail hour or for late night food? Make sure that you add all of that into the budget before you commit to a tent wedding. Oftentimes we see washrooms having to be rented. So whether that's a washroom trailer or porta potties, there are some super glam options out there and some kind of utilitarian options out there. So keep in mind whether you need to rent washrooms. And then you need to think about lighting to get to the washroom. If it's away from the tent, which you're also going to have to light if you're going to have an evening and night reception, you have to provide light to get to the washrooms. You have to provide light in the parking area. So thinking about the costs of lighting and then the logistics of how you're going to power that lighting. So do you have enough power for the lights, for the DJ or for the band? Do you have enough power for the caterers? I cannot tell you how many times we have had the caterers plug in, Jacqueline knows exactly where I'm going with this, plug in the coffee urn and blow a breaker because they take an astronomical amount of power. So
And
making
sorry to
sure.
interrupt Amy, if anyone's wondering when coffee gets brewed, typically like right when your dinner music wants to be starting. So everyone just hears scraping of forks and knives for a good 3 minutes and Amy and I scrambling to find the nearest breaker.
Yeah, it's one of those things that people don't usually think of, but yeah, we always make sure that we put it on the radar. And if you can possibly have an electrician come in and assess your power before you commit to a tent wedding, we've had couples who've had to put in complete additional services out to their shed or their garage or something because the house power wasn't going to be sufficient to run all of the things that need to be run. One of the first weddings I ever did way back in the day, it was a day of coordination. I didn't know to ask all of the questions, and we had a washroom trailer that had no power. We had a decorator who had used incandescent lighting instead of LED because it was, a million years ago. It was sucking too much power, and we had a live band and nobody had any power. So I'm scrambling on a Sunday afternoon trying to find a generator in London, Ontario, because we had no power for anything. It was awful.
No, thank you. Check your power.
Absolutely. Okay, so the third thing you'll want to think about is the overall flow of your day and how the layout and the floor plan are going to work with or work against the flow. So if you've thought about the kind of day that you want to have before you start looking at venues, it'll help you to determine whether the venue is appropriate. If you're doing a traditional setup where you do a ceremony, cocktail, dinner, dance, is the layout of the venue conducive to that? So you'll think about asking for a copy of the floor plan. Most venues will have an actual scale copy. If you're at a semi-inclusive venue, or if you're doing a tent wedding, a DIY venue, you may have to make this yourself. So if you are friends with an AutoCAD program, you might want to look into, creating a scale floor plan so that you're not just kind of estimating, oh, well, we'll have a table here and a table there. And then you find out that everything is disproportionate and out of scale and you can't actually fit as many guests. Or the other side is that you have way too much space for the number of guests. So we sometimes use a program called allseated.com. It's free, it's accessible online, and it will give you the table size, and then it gives you an allowance around the table for the chairs and the guests and the traffic paths. So thinking about that and asking your venue coordinator for one if you're at an all or semi-inclusive venue. And then being mindful of those spacing requirements. If you have people getting up to go to a buffet, you need to have room for them to walk around the tables or to get to the washroom. Or if you're having a plated dinner, you have to have space for the servers to get behind the tables. So making sure that you've got enough room for that, as well as thinking about if there are restrictions for social distancing still at the time of your wedding. Do you have enough room in the venue to accommodate for 6 feet between every table? If you're envisioning a separate ceremony, cocktail, and dinner space, is that possible in the venue that you're looking at? We have a lot of couples who want to do that big reveal of their beautiful dinner space. And you can't do that if it's accessible to guests during cocktail hour, because Aunt Marge is going to want to go in and sit at her table and hang her purse on her chair. And Grandpa's going to take off his jacket and hang it on the back of his chair. And then all of a sudden, when your photographers go to do detail shots of the room, which is something that commonly couples want before guests come in and mess it up, it's too late because your guests have already messed it up. So think about the flow of the day, the areas that you and your guests are going to utilize for different components of your day, and whether or not that's going to work for you.
Another thing to consider is where the washrooms are as well. We had a beautiful, beautiful reception space for dinner. And unfortunately, the only washroom they had to go through the dinner space, and they did want the big reveal, but there were a few guests that they can't cross their legs for 2 hours during a cocktail. They've got to go. And as well, if you do have a few guests that might be particular as to where their seats are, depending on the venue, they may not want to be located closest to the washroom. It might be something that gets brought up during Christmas dinner.
And the flip side of that is you might want to, if you have any pregnant guests, you might want to put them close to the washroom.
It's a great thing to consider for elderly family as well.
Yeah, and that kind of segues nicely into our fourth point, which is accessibility and access to the grounds. So keep in mind that you, as a young, excited, energetic, engaged person, are probably happy to go skipping out into a wheat field to get married. But what about any guests who have mobility issues, or maybe guests who just haven't dressed appropriately for awkward or distant locations? So thinking about that as you're looking at venues, whether you've got guests who are, mobility challenged, whether they're in wheelchairs or walkers or canes or elderly, or otherwise not as agile, you may need to provide ramps. You may need to rethink that ceremony out in the wheat field underneath the oak tree. Think about the ground as well. If you're doing an outdoor wedding and it happens to have poured rain the entire week before, is it going to create a soupy, muddy mess, or is it going to be okay so that you can still do your ceremony outside, for instance?
This is also huge for those who are planning backyard weddings. Be aware of if you have a septic tank in your backyard and there is tons of rain. You may find that you are without a venue because you can no longer put a tent up in your backyard legally anymore. So there's a lot to consider when it comes to weather in Ontario.
And the septic tank, actually, Jacqueline, thank you. That wasn't even on my radar. I mean, it's in the back of my brain somewhere, buried under
Forever burned because of all the lessons we've learned.
Yeah. So if you have a septic tank on private property, you actually can't put a tent over it. So you need to be mindful of where your septic tanks are. So that's a good point. Thinking about viewpoints as well. So obstructed views of either the ceremony or the dinner and the speeches is something that you'll want to think about. As well, is there a quieter space for older guests to go if you're going to have a loud pump and dance party? Maybe grandma doesn't want to sit right in front of the speaker. So thinking about making sure that all of your guests are comfortable depending on their stage of life and their particular needs. If you've got a lot of friends who are nursing, is there a space where they can go and breastfeed? At this day and age, I would like to think that it's so acceptable that they can breastfeed wherever they'd like to out in the open. But in terms of comfort levels, that is something that you may want to think about, providing that space or providing a separate lounge area for anybody who doesn't want to be on the dance floor. Is that possible in the venue that you're looking at? You'll want to think about lighting. We've done a lot of weddings at venues that have whole walls of windows, which can be really beautiful. Except if that window is west facing and you're doing dinner as the sun is setting and you put your head table in front of it, it's going to be shining right in all of your guests' eyes. So being thoughtful about the time of day, and that goes for ceremony locations as well. If you're going to have your ceremony at a space where the sun is going to be shining directly into the guests' eyes, or if there's no shade at your ceremony space. So thinking about those kinds of things before you commit to a space is really important as well. So maybe try and visit your ceremony site if you're thinking about doing it outdoors or in front of some windows. Try to visit it at the time you think it's likely to have your ceremony so that you can kind of test out what the sun is doing at that time. And that'll change during the seasons as well. So if you visit at 3 o'clock in January, the sun will be doing a very different thing than if you visit at 3 o'clock in July. So thinking about sun, light, shadows. Also, like we mentioned, the terrain. So if you have that wheat field ceremony, you might want to communicate that with your guests so that your friends don't show up in stilettos and get stuck in the mud or stuck in the ground. Thinking about how much of the grounds, if you have outdoor space with your venue, can you utilize it? Is there public access to those grounds as well? Is there a beautiful gazebo? Like I'm thinking of a particular venue here in London where there's this beautiful gazebo and then there's a bike path right behind it. So if you're getting married at that gazebo, are you okay with a biker crossing in the middle of your ceremony and yelling, "Woohoo, yeah!" Or "Don't do it"?
Or the classic bell ring behind. Yes, we see you. Thank you. We're aware.
And then the last point is specifically, I keep referring to this wheat field ceremony because I'm thinking of a ceremony that I did about 6 years ago where it was literally in the middle of a field and all of the guests got there on this smoking hot August day and they're all congregating underneath this beautiful maple tree on the front lawn. But the ceremony is like miles back in the field and they had a tractor with a hay wagon to pull guests to the ceremony, but nobody wanted to get on it. So by the end of the day, or by the time right before the ceremony, I almost wished I had a cattle prod to get them onto that wagon because it was like pulling teeth to get people back. And we ended up starting the ceremony about half an hour late because I just couldn't get the guests out into the sun. So thinking about guest comfort and guest transitions and guest accessibility, really, really important as well.
Definitely. I am always a huge fan if you know that you have some mobility issues within your guest list or even in your wedding party or a close family. Any venues that have a golf cart are a huge benefit in those situations. So, doing a quick ask, sometimes just the groundskeepers have them, but oftentimes the venue coordinator, if they have the opportunity to or the time, are always available to offer some shuttles services as well.
Absolutely. And so that, again, segues into the staff that the venue is going to provide, how much setup, teardown, and how they'll help with transitions. And that's really, really important, especially if you're doing a DIY venue where there is no staff, thinking about who will help with the setup, the teardown. And if you're doing day before and day after, that's great. But there are still things that are going to have to happen on the wedding day. Maybe you've got a beautiful ceremony arbor that needs to get moved to behind your head table. So thinking through the transitions and, just how things are going to get from A to B is really, really important. Now we have this lovely video that is not going to play right now. I tested the tech and it's not my friend today. So apologies. But the word room flip is something that we come across a lot. And essentially, it just means you set up the space for a ceremony, and then that same space transitions into your dinner space, usually while guests are moved to a separate cocktail space. Now, this is something that happens a lot in hotels or at golf courses. Where there are lots of staff to facilitate that transition. Sometimes that will fall to the caterers if you're at a semi-inclusive or at a DIY venue, but that's something that you need to make sure you think through really, really, really well. I did a wedding this past year at a couple's greenhouse. They had an old tobacco greenhouse on the family property. and they transitioned the ceremony space into the dinner space, but it required an incredible amount of pre-planning because there was a limited number of minutes for cocktail hour. I mean, you can't ask guests to have cocktails for 4 hours while you set things up from scratch. So we had to come up with a way to shave down the time on that room flip and make it as quick as possible. And it did go very smoothly, but it was certainly stressful for both myself and for the caterers, for sure.
It's always a benefit if you are on private property. If you do have some strong family members and you're able to preset your tables, that is a time saver and a half. But also, if you are in a situation where you may not have the strongest family members available to be lifting 8 table settings onto however long of a distance they have to walk, it's okay if you do have to set tables. Your guest might notice, they might join in to help if it's private property. It has to happen, but make sure that you do plan ahead, like Amy said.
Absolutely. Now, if you're at a venue that has staff, making sure you know exactly what they will do and what they won't do in regards to setup and tear down. Generally, we assume at an all-inclusive venue that they are going to handle all your hard setup, so your tables and your chairs and your linens. They're also going to set your places because they're providing the catering. And then they're going to clean up all of that as well. But will they deal with your centerpieces if you don't have a florist who's coming in and will set them up? Will they deal with your provided decor if you've brought in a photo display, or if you've brought in a card box, or if you've brought in a bunch of favors that need to be set up? Will they do that? Will they set out your place cards? If not, who will? If you're on private property, who does all of that kind of stuff on your wedding day? I always advise, if you're doing a tent wedding outdoors, that you don't want to set out any paper products the night before, any table numbers, any place cards, that kind of thing, because if it's damp at all, they're going to curl. So you want to make sure that you have accounted for someone to do that on your day. When are you going to be able to access the space? That's always a question you want to ask when you're viewing any venue. Can you set up the day before? Can you set up the day after? Is there an additional charge for that? We've kind of mentioned the guest transition thing, but it's worth reiterating here, because if you're on private property especially, how do the guests know when they move from the cocktail hour into the barn or into the tent to sit down for dinner? If you're at a venue where there's a venue coordinator, is that something that they do, or are they going to be busy running a tour for another potential couple at that time? And is that going to then fall to your DJ or your MC to manage that timeline? So being aware of who's going to cue those transitions so that guests aren't confused, or so that they're not sitting at their table for 45 minutes before they're meant to, going, okay, what's happening? What do I do now? It's awkward for guests. So make sure you know who does that. We've talked about the room flip. That's going to take time, and it's going to mean that you have to get your guests out of the space. So there has to be, if you're going to have to flip that space, there has to be a separate cocktail area, because trying to do a room flip while you've got 100 guests underfoot is just a recipe for disaster and dropped plates and, candles lighting things on fire. So
I know I sound like the risk management queen over here and like Debbie Downer, but please make sure that your plan for guests during your room flip isn't for them to go outside for some fresh air, because whenever that is your plan, inevitably it's going to be pouring rain during that specific moment when you need guests to just go outside for 3 minutes. It's happens every single time. That's the backup plan. So always have a covered space for your guests to go.
Absolutely. Something else to think about is if you've got, this usually applies to a semi-inclusive or a DIY venue, but if you've got a ceremony space that's different from your dinner space, are there going to be 2 sets of chairs? Are you going to only have 1 set of chairs? And if so, who moves them? Is it venue staff? Is it catering staff? Is it your responsibility? Do you have to have your officiant ask the guests to move their chairs after the ceremony? Thinking through that is going to be something you'll want to do at some point. I mean, it's probably not a deal breaker for a venue, but you'll definitely want to think about whether you want to spend the money on 2 sets of chairs or staff to move them, or have someone, maybe your cousins, take care of that. You need to know when you're going to have to remove all of your personal decor and items from the venue. And something that I actually didn't write down here, but I will add it after, is some venues have a bridal suite. And so finding out what the restrictions on the bridal suite are. Can you and your girls get ready there in the morning? Or is it just meant to be a place for you to drop your purses and leave your private, your personal belongings, maybe lock up your cards once the card box is cleared? How do you access that space? Do you have free reign over it all night? Is there a key that you have to get to enter? Do you have to ask a venue staff to let you in? Is there a keypad that you get the code to? Is it unlocked all night? So those are some things to think about, because you will have stuff with you. Often guys and groomsmen will have tux bags that need to come with them. There may be purses or wallets or phones that you don't want to have with you out on your tables. So thinking about whether there's space at the venue for you to leave your belongings, and then also for your vendors. So cameras, camera bags, video equipment, all of those things come with, equipment that needs to be stored somewhere. So thinking about whether there's room at the venue for storage of those kinds of things. And where are you going to put your boxes from the decor that you've brought in? Where is your florist going to store the flats that your centerpieces came in? Those kinds of things are worth thinking through as well, because there's a lot of stuff that comes with a wedding and you're going to need to store it somewhere while it's not being used. And then finally, thinking through house music or some kind of music for your guests. How is that going to be facilitated? Is there a house system that you can play a playlist through? Are you bringing in a DJ who's going to have their system? Are there any restrictions on what the DJs can do with the venue? So thinking through the musical elements of your day is going to be helpful as well. And so just to close off here, some general tips. And I mean, we could continue talking forever, but we're at 41 minutes here. So we're going to try and tie this up into a neat little bow here. Like I mentioned right off the top, make sure you start with a solid budget and guest list, realistic budget and guest list. Don't pull numbers out of thin air. Don't say, oh, I think 100 guests is going to be nice, because once you start adding them up, you'll realize that you have a billion cousins and you have to invite them all. So make sure that you know what's realistic beforehand. If you're struggling with your budget, little plug here, we are running a budget workshop that is going to take place both in person and virtually. So you can sign up in person here in London, or you can sign up virtually if you're tuning in from somewhere else. It's running on February 23rd and 24th. And we'll plug a link into the chat afterwards so that you can sign up for that if you're struggling with how to create a realistic budget, or if you're finding that that's already creating some tension between you and your partner. But realistic budget, realistic guest list, so important before you start the the venue search. When you're venue shopping, don't bring everybody and your cousin with you. Don't bring both sets of parents. Don't bring your whole entourage. The smaller the number of people, the fewer opinions you're going to have. I mean, maybe if your parents are paying for a large part of it, you're going to want to bring one of them along, but trying to keep, just like when you're gown shopping, trying to keep the numbers down is going to make it a little bit easier for you and your partner, just to focus on you and what you want, what's important to you. Come with a list of questions and notes. So being prepared before you go to see the venue, make sure that you've checked it out online, make sure that you've looked at any packages they've sent you and any information they've given you. If there are any discrepancies or questions that you have, make sure that you ask those at the consult. And it's kind of like house shopping. Don't book too many venue visits in one day. It's just all going to blend into each other. If you try to see 5 or 6 or 7 venues in one day, you're going to get overwhelmed really quickly. So if it's at all possible, try to keep it to 3 venues or less on one day. You're going to make sure that you're taking pictures and taking notes as you go, because you'll think that you'll remember it all. But then at the end of the day, you're going to be tired and you're going to say, oh, was that cute little bar at venue A or was it at venue B? And it'll all blend together. So make sure that you're taking pictures and keeping yourself organized. I'm a big fan of charts. So make a comparison chart. If you have it down to 2 or 3 venues, hop on Excel or Google Sheets and just make a little comparison of what is provided, what's not provided, what the costs are, and hopefully that will help you to make your final decisions. don't make snap decisions. A lot of venues will put a tentative hold on a date for you if you ask without a deposit. So if you know that you're interested and you're afraid that someone else is going to snap up that venue before you get to it, ask if they will put a hold on it for, maybe even it's only 24 hours, or maybe it's only 48 hours, but it'll give you a little bit of time and space to breathe. Just like you wouldn't want to buy a house on the spur of the moment, you want to think about it. Although in today's housing market, it seems like you need to make a
Yeah.
snap decision. Same thing in today's wedding market. If you're looking for 2022, probably there are very few dates remaining, but don't hesitate to ask if they will hold a date before you just make a decision right on the spot, because you want to make sure that you have time to read those contracts and really understand what you're getting yourself into before you sign on that dotted line, and then later come back and have regrets about something that you didn't know was included or not included, or an additional charge that you missed because you signed too fast and you didn't read through the contract carefully.
I think Amy and I can both speak on experience. How many times we meet up with our couples at that 8-week meeting and we ask questions about their venue, and there's a couple I don't knows, but they're pretty detrimental I don't knows, such as overnight parking. So you need to know, are your guests okay to leave their cars overnight? Are you okay to leave your car overnight? Or do you have to figure out how you're getting everything out? So make sure you're reading those contracts. It's huge.
And another one that often couples are not really clear on is the end time. What time does the bar close? What time do you need to be out of there? I think it's pretty common for people to assume that the bar stays open until 1. We work at a couple of venues that shut it down at 11. Or we actually work at a venue as well where it's an outdoor indoor space. And if you've chosen to use the outdoor space with a tent for your dinner and dance, you have to move that dance inside at 11 o'clock because it's in a residential area and because London's noise bylaws kick into place at 11. So being really, really aware of those kinds of things before you sign, really important.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you for sticking with us here. If you've made it from the beginning to the end and listened to me ramble, congratulations. I feel like there needs to be a special award for that.
No, I've got to learn a trumpet flare.
So as always, we are here. If you have any questions at all, we are here to support you throughout your planning. And join us next week for our last installment in our venue series. And Jacqueline, I was racing in after grabbing groceries. What are we talking about next week?
I was racing in after a lovely update. So give me 1 second. I'll double check. I'm almost positive that we are chatting about. Give me
It's
1 second.
venues. I know it's venues.
I know it's venue related. We're chatting all about how to plan if you are doing the DIY, because that in itself deserves a 45-minute chat.
Right. We're going to really focus in on those DIY venues next week. Yeah. Thank you for reminding me about that.
Thanks, people.
All right. So have a great week, and we will catch up with you next week, Sunday at 1. We're talking about DIY venues. Have a good one, folks, and happy planning.
Bye, everybody.